On today's episode, we look at what happens when managers hire from a short list of people to fill positions on their teams. They often end up overlooking the best talent, they fail to draw fresh perspective or experience into the organization, and often fall victim to their own nearsightedness and biases. It's understandable as not many of us are trained in talent recruitment and hiring, but that's why it's so critical that we fine-tune and formalize some of these processes. Based on findings conducted by my guest Brian Lucas and his research team at Cornell's ILR School, there is a fix. You make your short list longer by considering a larger pool of candidates and broaden your search so that your team and your company can bring in the very best. It seems pretty straightforward, but this is actually a proven strategy and there are actionable steps you can take right now. So let's dive into my conversation with Brian Lucas. So to set the table for the conversation, you wanted us to understand two key concepts. We were talking about this a moment ago. The dynamics at play in what are called informal hiring situations, and then the gender biases that take place as a result. So let's talk about those two things. Informal, what are we talking about?
Okay, sure. All right. So first, informal hiring situations. So these are hiring situations where, let's say you work in an organization, you're in charge of a new hire. And what you're going to do is you're going to mostly rely on your personal connections and your networks to help fill this. So you might sit down and write a short list of the candidates that you think would be good for the job. You might have people in your network referring people to you. So it's all about recruiting through networks and personal connections. And so this is in contrast to more formal recruitment channels, which would involve kind of formally writing up a job description, posting it on various recruitment websites, waiting for the applications to come in, kind of what we'd think of as the traditional way of recruiting people.
So when we're talking about this informal process, it's not necessarily binary, right? I mean, ultimately, we're going to get to a point where we're going to discuss the merits of having a short list, knowing some people, making connections, and also the formal processes. Just for clarity, the informal hiring process is kind of a healthy thing, right?
Oh, certainly. Yeah, I think one way to think about it, too, is that you can think about a process with many different components to it, and some of them are going to be more informal, and some of them will be formal. So, for instance, you could imagine a process it's full of both things. So you have people going off, building connections, trying to get referrals, building the talent pool that way. And then you have the formal process that are bringing in applications through those formal channels, and then all of those things merging together. So you could imagine a spectrum that might go from fully informal all the way to fully formal, with kind of both of those processes humming along.
Yeah, it's funny when we were putting our questions together, I kept finding myself, although I understand the limitations to it, the benefits of having an informal process. It's been my experience in life that life is about connections in a lot of ways. And, full transparency, a lot of people on our production team are referred, that's how we get some of our best talent in here from a production standpoint, at least this part of our business, right? The people understand the roles, they understand the jobs, and boy, I have a person who's perfect for this kind of thing. This happens a lot. Talk about the continued benefits of an informal process like this.
Oh, certainly. And I think that would resonate with a lot of people's experiences.
Yeah.
And so, if you think about it, if you're the one working in the organization, you're the one hiring for the role, you know the role the best. In fact, maybe you created it. That gives you a lot of insider information. And That insider information gives you leverage for thinking about who's the best person to fill this role. So you're going to have a lot of information there that people on the outside might not have, and that can help you locate some of the best talent for a position. So yes, a lot of hiring does get done that way. And, it kind of makes sense. There's a rationale to it. So in the research that we do, first off, there are a number of different biases that are going to creep in here. I'm going to focus here on gender biases because that's what we focused on in our research. But certainly, so when you're thinking about creating a short list for a specific role, one of the things is that many roles in organizations, they are gendered and they have what we would call a gender prototype, meaning that when you think about who is the ideal person to fill this role, you're going to imagine someone in your mind and they will probably have a gender. They present more male, they might present more female. And a lot of gender stereotypes that we have in society guide those prototypes. So for instance, we often associate men with physical strength. So when you imagine something like a construction worker, you're probably thinking of a man over a woman, or if you think about something like a police officer. And then we also associate men with technology, with science, with math. And you can think about the roles that are associated with those, things like engineers, STEM positions. Research has shown that when we look at the associations with gender there, we tend to associate those roles more with men than with women. And so part of the issue there is that when we're looking at this process of using these informal shortlists or these other informal recruitment processes where the people that make the list are just the ones that come to people's minds readily, if you are of the gender that's not automatically being seen as a fit for that role, you might not make the list simply because you're not coming to mind first. You might be an equally qualified candidate that's simply not coming to mind, and that's why you're not making these lists.
Good. So we'll get to how to fix that problem in a little bit here. So you caught my attention back months ago when we began talking. You co-wrote an article in Harvard Business Review. We're going to share the URL with the audience, by the way. It's based on your research that you do at Cornell entitled To Reduce Gender Bias in Hiring, Make Your Short List Longer. So tell us about the research in that article, some of the outcomes and findings that were associated with it.
Sure. Yep. And so the starting point for that article is kind of the observation that we just talked about here. So part of the difficulty of gender equity in situations where people are using these informal shortlist processes. So essentially the question is, how can we get the non-prototypical candidates to be more top of mind so that they end up making these lists? And we came up with a very simple intervention that we tested in this research. And the simple intervention was just to make the shortlist longer. And so there's a rationale behind this that came from the creativity literature, which is my other area of research that we talked about earlier. And the general finding in that literature is that when you're generating a bunch of ideas over time, those ideas tend to become more creative over time. So they tend to deviate from the status quo. They tend to deviate from the category prototype. And when you generate ideas over time, they become more creative. So if you take that logic and you move it into this context, in a context where you have a role that's maybe male prototype, so people tend to think about men when they think about people who would be appropriate for this role. If you take that logic and then apply it, the idea would be that, well, if you just keep coming up with more names and listing more people, eventually those names should become less prototypical. So in this context, meaning they would be less male prototyped. So more women and other gender minorities in this context.
The way that you did this is you sort of, I don't know if this is the right terminology, extracted the hiring manager from the organization and just sort of tell me about the methodology here, because I found this interesting.
Yeah, definitely. So what we're looking here, the phenomenon we're trying to capture here is really getting at the psychology of how hiring managers think about these situations. So because of this, instead of going into an organization and kind of, checking out all of their processes and all the things that they got going on here, what we did is that we surveyed hiring managers themselves and put them into these hypothetical hiring situations to see how they would think about them. So across our different surveys, we would have hiring managers from a number of different industries. Based on the context that we're using, sometimes we would recruit them from specific industries. So for instance, I'll tell you about a study in the tech industry, and we were recruiting people with hiring experience in the technology industry. I'll kind of walk you through an example of what these studies would look like. So the first domain that we tested was Hollywood action heroes. Now, I know that's not a typical organizational domain to hire in, but what we were trying to do there was we were trying to look for a domain that had a clearly strong gender stereotype. And Hollywood action heroes are stereotypically masculine and male. And so we thought that would be a good context to start in here. So what we did is that we recruited participants and we had them play the role of a Hollywood producer. We told them that they're going to make an action movie, and we described it very stereotypically. There's going to be explosions, there's going to be shootouts, car chases, all of that. And what we wanted them to do is to come up with a short list of people who they thought would be good to star in that movie. And here's the specific protocol that we used. So we had them first just list 3 names. So list 3 actors that you think would be good to star in this film. After they did that, we had them extend their short list by simply just having them list 3 more people. So now we have an initial short list of 3 names, and we have an extended short list of 3 additional names. And what we were looking for here is, did the gender composition of the list change from that initial list to the extended list? And generally speaking, across our studies, that's what we found. So in our studies using the Hollywood action hero domain, we actually found that on average, there was about a 33% increase in the number of women listed in the extended list compared to the initial list. And just to give people a sense of what that effect size would look like. So in the initial list, about 1 in 8 people listed were women. And in the extended list, that changed to about 1 in 6.
And you did something similar for tech executives. Nice to look at those numbers too. Can you tell me about that?
Yep. And so for these studies, we use the exact same protocol, but here we're setting it in a more typical organizational setting. So we're looking at recruiting for a tech executive position. So in our studies, we recruited people who indicated having experience with these types of hiring situations. And we told them that we gave them information about a hypothetical technology company. Again, trying to make it sound a little stereotypical. So set in California, dealing with new technologies. And we told them that they're trying to hire a new executive. And we asked participants to recommend people that they could hire for this position. And keep in mind here, so these are people in the industry. So they're actually suggesting real names here, even though it's a hypothetical scenario. So these are people that we could later on go up and look up online. And so what we did the same protocol there, where we had them generate a list of 3 names, then we had them extend that list by adding 3 more names to it. And we found a very similar pattern of results. So the extended list, what we found had 44% increase in women over the initial list. And so in terms of effect size, that's about a 1 in 6 women to men ratio, moving down to about a 1 in 4 women to men ratio.
Right. So, implicit, or rather the through line in our conversation, and viewer Terry asks the ultimate question here. How do you recommend communicating this to current hiring managers, explaining that we need to expand the short list? Let's go for a longer list. How do you give them the why behind it? Well, this conversation's part of that, right? I think these articles are also really useful. So I want to make sure that we share these. These are starting points, but I think I recommend for anybody, Terry and others, is to check out these articles. It's a good sort of springing off point. We're not trying to solve these issues within the hour. That's a great challenge. But that's exactly what we were hoping to do, is to elicit further action and have our audience learn about this stuff. And of course, there's a lot of eCornell online certificates and courses that address this on a much bigger level, right? So if you're a hiring manager aspiring to become better at your job in every way, reducing gender bias, getting the most quality people in, those are 2 places to start. So I want to thank you, Terry, for that question. So we are kind of getting in prescriptive mode here. How do we fix this short list problem? So what do you recommend? What does Wide recommend? And you yourself, Brian Lucas.
So specifically to Terry's question, how you communicate it, the advice I would give there would be kind of know your situation and communicate it in the way that you think would be most effective. So there's a nice aspect of this intervention, which is that adding more people to the list tends to just increase conversation around a wider number of candidates, which actually tends to be beneficial on a number of different dimensions. So here we're specifically talking about gender equity, but there are a number of different dimensions, such as other social categories or even just skills and experiences that you might want in a particular hire that's going to benefit from having that wider candidate pool. So for instance, if you're pitching this to a hiring manager, you could frame it as an intervention to improve gender equity, or you could frame it as an intervention to improve whichever these other things that you're trying to hire for. So I think that you have some flexibility there in how you're pitching this to others.
Empathy is a big thing. Tell me a little bit about that. We had talked about this the other day when we were prepping this show. Any thoughts on empathy? I mean, this is huge. It's essential to everything.
Oh, certainly. So this is kind of another class of things that we could do about this issue. Yeah. And here it's kind of categorized under changing perceptions of the job role. So the idea here is if the job is thought of in people's minds as more of a male prototyped role, well, one thing you could do here is to try to change people's perceptions of the role itself. So for instance, you could emphasize the skills that would be necessary in that role and emphasize ones that are more consistent with the traits that are more stereotypically associated with women. So for instance, most leadership roles would highly benefit from leaders that are collaborative, empathetic, who can understand their employees. And those are traits that are stereotypically associated with women, but sometimes tend not to actually be put into the job descriptions of these roles. So one thing we could do is just kind of change the way we describe these roles to change the associations that people make with those jobs.
I've got an interesting comment that comes in from Andrew, who says, I'm 53. I've had 4 or 5 careers and countless jobs. Only 2 I got purely from submitting the application, going through what sounds like he's identified, I think, the formal process, right? Not knowing anybody, having no connection to the company, no in, so to speak. Whereas every other job he's had, it's come from knowing somebody. How about the frequency of either people being hired through the informal versus formal? How do those 2 scenarios stack up?
Yeah, that's a really good...
we hadn't thought about that before.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So what I think, based on survey data, it sounds like Andrew's experience is probably pretty common, maybe representative. So one thing I will say is it's kind of hard to get exact numbers on these things, partly because these informal processes, the things that are happening behind the scenes, There isn't like a log where the companies are documenting these things, so we can't go back and look at the hard numbers. So I'll give you a couple data points though that we can kind of use to get a ballpark. So let's start on the high side, or on Andrew's perspective. So if you look at surveys of employees and you ask them questions like, did your last job come through a referral, yes or no? You get upwards of 70% of employees saying yes to that question. So it sounds like a lot of people are finding their jobs through those channels. I'll give you one on the low side. There was a survey that was done a number of years ago of employers, and it asked them the question, for the last position that you filled in your organization, did you formally post a job ad? About 28% of them said no. And so we're kind of at both sides. Now let me give you a number in the middle. So this number is actually coming from the research of J.R. Keller, professor in HR here that you've talked to on this show. So he did research on internal hiring.
Right.
And he was looking at the proportion of these jobs that are filled that have a formal job post versus are just kind of filled at the manager's discretion. And he found something a little over 50% of these roles were filled at the manager's discretion with no formal job posting made. So, we have a range of numbers here from about a quarter to about 3/4 of people, kind of reporting these things. I think the takeaway from that is that, for me at least, is the answer is certainly not zero.
Yeah.
The answer seems probably significantly higher than that. So when we ask how prevalent are these practices, I think it's a little hard to put an exact number on it, but I think we can say that they're prevalent enough that they matter.
So let's get back to actionable next steps for our viewers. This is something that I think is useful. It kind of relates to what Terry was getting at, right? Like, how do I turn around and make the case for this? Are there things that HR pros or people or hiring managers can do to bring these practices into their work? Because we talked about this before, and this comes up almost in every workforce-related interview that we do, which is a lot of people aren't trained on interviewing or doing this stuff. We don't typically have, outside of the human resources umbrella, people that are actually trained to do interviews. So for the people that are on the hiring manager side, building teams or whatever, you had mentioned something called the advanced pathway audit. What's that about? This is cool.
Yeah, so the advancement pathway audit. So this is an exercise that I encourage particularly hiring managers to go through, but actually anyone working in an organization could do this. So this is something that you would do on your own. Maybe you could do it with a trusted colleague that can, kind of check your information and make sure you're doing it honestly for yourself. But essentially what you're going to do here is you're going to just make a list of all of the advancement pathways in your organization over which you have some amount of control or influence. And so there are kind of typical examples of this. Like if you're a manager and you're hiring an employee to work for you, that's a pretty typical example of having control over an advancement pathway. But there are also a lot of other ones that we tend not to think of so much. So for instance, you have control over promotions. You have control over who gets recommended for different types of training, who gets recommended for high profile projects. And even if you're not a manager, let's say you're an entry-level employee, you still have some control over these advancement pathways in that at some point you will probably provide ratings for your teammates, like maybe as part of a 360-degree survey. And so your input does matter for these other people. So what you should do is you're making a list of all of these ways that you have control over advancement pathways. And then what you're doing is that you're auditing it to think about different ways that bias might be creeping into those evaluations. So for instance, you could think about whether gender stereotypes are playing a role here. Mm-hmm. So for example, I heard one story about someone who was thinking about which of their employees to promote to the next level. And they learned that when they got promoted to the next level, that job would require a lot more travel. So a lot more travel than the current role. And one thing that this person was doing is that they weren't considering the female candidates as much because they assumed that they would want to be home with their families and not travel.
Okay.
So, just ways there that I don't think that they were intending to be biased, but just ways that those stereotypes lead bias to creep into those decisions. And so that's really what you're trying to do with this advancement pathways audit, is just to really be blunt about the places that you have control over other people or influence over other people's advancement, and being honest with yourself about whether or not biases might be creeping into those.
In short, kind of like the title suggests, make your short list longer in order to combat bias, get the highest quality candidates, right? I mean, that's effectively what we're recommending here, yes?
Yes, that's what we're recommending here. And I think that it's consistent with just a lot of research on decision making and hiring, just that generally considering more information is typically a better thing.
Perfecto. So audience, couple things to check out. Check out Brian's longer shortlist Harvard Business Review article. We've got something that was published in Nature, nature.com, and also some of the work that's done at Wide. So if any of this information we've discussed here appeals to you and you can bring it into your toolkit as a hiring manager or an HR pro, definitely do it. This is just the first step, hopefully, for many of you today. Brian Lucas, thank you for joining me in the studio today.
Thanks for having me.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for listening to Cornell Keynotes. Be sure to check out the episode notes for information on human resources certificate programs at Cornell. Thanks again, friends, and subscribe to stay in touch.